Good morning. My name is Kerry Wasden. I'm the professor for the Economics 200 Macroeconomics course at BYU Hawaii online. If you're taking this class, hopefully you've had a little bit of experience spending money. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how you think when you spend money. Economics is an interesting subject. The course that we have presented online has a combination of traditional avenues of learning and some non-traditional ones as well. The slides that you're currently seeing next to me are directly dovetailing with my conversation, my comments. Whenever you see a red phrase or term, like the word economics at the top of this slide, that's red because we want you to take some extra care and extra effort in your note-taking to make sure that you really understand this term. Any red phrase or term, you should be able to define and be able to practically apply it to regular parts in your life. I'll mention that a few more times as we go through these slides, but just remember, anytime you see a red phrase in the slides, you'll want to take special care and attention with that. So let's talk about some definitions. Economics. Economics is nothing more than the study of how people allocate their limited resources to satisfy their unlimited wants. Now we're going to talk about what a limited resource is in more detail in a minute, but just think about that from the perspective of resources are your time, your education, money, land. Typically that's considered land, labor, and capital. Those are resources. And in general, they're limited. We only have 24 hours in a day. Because we have limited time, we have to choose what we do with our time. On the other side, we have to satisfy our unlimited wants, the things we want to do, the things we would like to pay for. Everyone has unlimited wants. Even somebody like Bill Gates has unlimited wants. So economics is nothing more than the study of how people allocate those limited resources to satisfy their unlimited wants. In its essence, it's the study of how people make choices. Part of the way we make choices is by responding to incentives. And economists and economics tries to study the incentives that were given and how people respond to them. Incentives are nothing more than rewards for engaging in certain activities. Our incentives can be positive and negative, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes as well. This develops this idea called an economic way of thinking. All it is a framework, a guideline for how to analyze solutions to economic problems. And as you'll think, and as we think as economics, everything in its essence can be boiled down to being an economic problem. For example, how much time to study? You have to work at PCC, you have to go to class, then you have some study time. You have some social demands on your time. You may have some extracurricular demands as well. So how much time you study is an economic problem. And you need to make some choices based upon the fact that you have limited resources, the time that you have to study, and you probably have some unlimited wants with what you would like to do with that time. So how much time to study requires the economic way of thinking to be able to make choices. In addition, you may choose to take certain courses because you enjoy them. You may choose to take other courses because they help you get a better job. Those are also economic choices. Recently, we've made some choices on where to deploy troops from the United States of America. Those are also economic choices. The economic way of thinking gives you a power. It's a decision-making power. It's a power to reach informed conclusions about what is happening in the world. However, you'll notice that many people have different views of how things should work in the world. So despite the fact that we have this economic way of thinking, we can all reach fairly divergent and very different conclusions with the same information. So just because we have an economic way of thinking doesn't mean that everybody's going to reach the same conclusion. However, it does hopefully mean that we'll reach informed conclusions. And the conclusions we reach are because of our analysis. And the economic analysis we do, we're going to train you how to do in this class. So economic analysis helps you make better decisions, increases your understanding. So when you're watching things on the news and when you're looking at articles on the web, you'll be able to use this economic analysis capability that we're going to teach this semester and make better sense out of the things that you both watch and read. Economic analysis is a way of thinking about all decisions. It'll impact your education, your career, when or how to finance your home, how many children you should have, where you should live. All of these are economic decisions. Those impact you as a person. It also impacts your business and the businesses you'll work for, and how you vote as a voter. Let's do a few more definitions. Resources. These are things that we use to produce other things that satisfy people's wants. Wants are what people would buy if their incomes were unlimited. Think about Bill Gates. His income's not unlimited, but in comparison to most of us, it seems pretty unlimited. So what would people buy? What would a Bill Gates buy compared to us if our incomes were unlimited? Those are wants. Now you'll notice we haven't really talked about needs. And we'll talk about this again a little bit later in the class. But economics does not deal with needs. We only deal with wants. Everybody does have different needs, and it's very difficult to put economic terms around those issues. So we deal with resources, things that are used to produce other things that people want, and wants, what people would buy if their incomes were unlimited. We don't deal with needs. With limited incomes, you and I have limited incomes. Probably some of you are working at the PCC making $7.25 an hour. That's a limited income. Because you have limited incomes, you can't have everything that you would like to have. That resource, which is limited, forces you to make choices. We never have enough of everything, including time, to satisfy every one of our desires, so consequently we must have choices made. Our nations make choices. They don't have unlimited resources. Companies have to make choices. They don't have unlimited resources. Families and individuals, we also have to make choices because our resources are not unlimited. They're very limited. All economics is a study of how we make choices. A few more definitions. We have two broad categories of economics. One is called microeconomics, and the term micro implies that it's smaller, and that's true. And the other one is macroeconomics, and that term implies that things are larger, and that's true. Let's hit microeconomics as well. Or first of all, microeconomics is the study of decision-making undertaken by individuals or households and by firms. That's microeconomics. So if I'm looking at why I buy a certain cereal as an individual, that's microeconomics. If I'm looking at how my family takes vacations as a household, that's microeconomics. If I'm looking at how my firm responds to a change in prices for wheat or flour or sugar, that's microeconomics, because those three things impact firms, households, and individuals. Like looking through a microscope to focus on smaller parts of the economy, microeconomics focuses on families, individuals, and firms. Macroeconomics, by contrast, focuses on the broader activities of an economy as a whole. Deals with economy-wide phenomena such as the national unemployment rate. Currently, we're trying to recover from a recession. Our national unemployment rate is high. If I were to discuss the national unemployment rate, that would be a macroeconomic indicator. If I were to talk about the impact of my father being unemployed, that would be microeconomic. For example, the rate of growth in the money supply of an economy. Currently, as we're trying to get out of this current recession, the Federal Reserve is increasing the money supply to try and get the economy to grow. That's happening on a macroeconomic level, as an economy as a whole. Consequently, it's a macroeconomic indicator. Any government's national budget deficit or trade deficit, these are also macroeconomic issues. Macroeconomics commonly deals with a term called aggregates. For example, if you and all of your friends were the only people in an economy and what you produced was the economic production for that economy, what we would do to calculate the production is do nothing more than add up all of your friends' production. We would aggregate that production, and that would equal the total production for the whole economy. Modern economic theory tends to blend microeconomics and macroeconomic concepts. Let's give a recent example. When George Bush was president, just before he was to leave office, President Barack Obama had already been elected but had not taken office yet. George Bush passed a stimulus program. And in that stimulus program, what the economists decided they would do was give a check to every individual in the country. The check amounted to about $750 per person. The reason why they gave the check is because they wanted to stimulate the economy, and they thought that if they gave a check to people, people would take that money, cash the check, and go and spend it. That spending would then cause people to make more products, and those products would then get purchased by the people with their stimulus checks, and that would employ more people, and it would cause an expansion in the economy. What happened, however, is a misunderstanding of this blending between microeconomic and macroeconomic concepts. Because what really happened is people took their checks, they took them to the bank, and they deposited them and saved the money instead of spending the money. And the reason why is they were nervous. They didn't know what the future of the economy was going to hold. And so they thought it would be a better and more prudent thing to save the money for future uncertainty than it would be to spend it. So that misunderstanding of how microeconomic and macroeconomic concepts combine made it so that that stimulus didn't work very well. And so we are constantly tweaking those concepts, trying to make sure that the micro and the macro work well together. One of the things we need to focus on, and probably one of the dominant aspects of economics, is this idea called rational self-interest. It is what the definition of what we call the economic person. And what we assume is that all of us are rational. And what we do when we make an economic choice is we sit back and we think about it, and we think, well, if I'm going to buy this automobile, how rational of a choice is it? Do I really need the car? And if I need a car, do I need this car? I could buy a Volkswagen Golf, or I could buy a Porsche Panamera. Which one should I buy? And the economic analysis that we go through in that process is bounded by what's called rationality. We assume that we are rational people. So economists assume that individuals act as if they're motivated by self-interest. In other words, we're not going to do things that will make us worse off. And we respond predictably for opportunities for gain. Now, this all comes from a guy named Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote the book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. He wrote the book in 1776. And this book was really the foundation for modern economic thought. In this book, he said the following: "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner." In other words, these people are not just giving us dinner for free, but it's in regard to their own self-interest. And this concept of self-interest became one of the real guiding concepts of modern economic thought. This creates this thing called the rationality assumption. And I've mentioned this already, but let's state it again. It is the assumption that people do not intentionally make decisions that would leave them worse off. In fact, we do the opposite. We try and make decisions that will make us better off. Now, this takes us to an interesting idea called neuroeconomics. And this is a good example. When I was your age, which seems like a long time ago, but when I was your age, I was studying medicine. And in my studies of medicine, I loved neurophysiology, which studied the physiology of the brain and the central nervous system. And what was interesting is that we assumed, as scientists, that the brain at the time of puberty received its final changes and never changed again. In other words, we assumed that the brain was not plastic, but it stayed the same. Now, in the last 15 years, that assumption has been completely turned on its head and has made significant changes to how we view economics. All right, so let's test this rationality assumption just a little bit. A gentleman named Dan Ariely, who is a professor of behavioral economics at Duke University, conducted a number of experiments and published them in a couple of books, one of which is called Predictably Irrational. In this experiment, he took a Hershey's Kiss and hundreds of students at Duke University. And he said, look, this Hershey's Kiss costs 1 cent. And then he also gave them the option of purchasing a Lindt truffle for 15 cents. Now you can acknowledge with your basic math that there's a 14-cent difference between the price of these two products. 1 cent for the Hershey's Kiss and 15 cents for the Lindt truffle. In his analysis, he found that 74% of the students were willing to pay the extra 14 cents and get the Lindt truffle. Interesting, and it seems pretty rational. People value the taste. Then what he did is a very interesting, subtle change. He said, I'm going to give you the Hershey's Kiss for free. And now I'm going to charge you 14 cents for the Lindt truffle. Still a 14-cent difference. That's it. The economics are the same. In that environment, 69% of the students chose the Hershey's Kiss, not the Lindt truffle. Does that question your rationality assumption? Perhaps it should. This is very interesting and leads us to a very interesting discussion about neuroeconomics. When I was roughly your age, I was studying medicine at Ohio State University. In my studies, I came across a number of very interesting discussions about neurophysiology. My actual degree was a doctoral degree in international development and finance from the School of Business, but I had a lot of interest in medicine, and so I would dabble over in the medical school in a number of their courses. What we learned, and what we thought we learned, is that the brain stopped changing and stopped developing after we reached puberty. So it changed, it was plastic, it could move, it could adjust to influences until we reached puberty, and then it stopped. It became less plastic. That was interesting and had significant impact on how we make economic choices. We assume that by the time we pass into adulthood, who we are is determined by a brain that is fixed. Now, what we realize, and certainly over the last 15 years, what we've found is that the brain isn't stuck after our puberty years. In fact, it's plastic, and it's plastic well into adulthood. In fact, even somebody at my age has a very plastic brain that can change according to its influences. And the most significant part of what makes our brain change is conscious thought. So neuroeconomics, the study of how the brain works as we make economic choices, has become a very, very powerful field. Now I've brought with us a past accounting student who has been kind enough to donate to us his brain. This is called Grumpy, and inside the skull here we have a replica or a model of the human brain. The reason why I brought this, and I'll bring it to a number of our lectures, is that we're going to study why this brain does what it does, why we make choices using this brain. We're sort of unique as human beings. We have this part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. This is where we make our conscious thoughts. This is where we do our analysis. This is where we weigh data and ideas and make choices. This area, part of the hypothalamus or the amygdala, is the emotional part of our brain. This is where we make emotional choices. Now, apes and other mammals don't have this part of their brain. So their choices are made almost completely on instinct and on emotion. We have a different type of brain where we can make emotional choices, and we can also have those choices checked by this prefrontal or very rational part of our brain. Men and women have different brains. A number of books have been written about that. They're all very interesting. But what we assume is that women are more emotional. They tend to cry more. They tend to watch movies that are more emotional. And so we assume that women make emotional decisions, certainly regarding money and other things, more often than men do. It's actually false. Men are more emotional than women are when making financial choices. So when you see a guy driving a Porsche around, you have to think about it and think, he's not driving that Porsche because, oh, it was a really good deal, or certainly he needed it as opposed to a Toyota Camry. He's driving it for emotional reasons. He's driving it because his amygdala said, you know what, this will make you really hot. And all those girls are going to want to join with you as their eternal companion if you drive a Porsche. So his amygdala took over his economic choice making, and he got rid of the prefrontal cortex. No rational decision-making choices there. That was all emotion. So we're going to study your neuroeconomics in some detail and how it impacts our economic decision-making. Excuse me. Okay, so does what we now know about rational self-interest and our ability to make rational choices impact how we do certain things? Impact our assumption about economics? Probably not. Economic models can still be applied to situations where our behavior is at odds with what we expect from rational people. And that's okay. Let's talk about responding to incentives a little bit more. Rationality, the use of incentives, positive incentives. For example, you may get good grades because your parents have agreed that they'll pay you for getting good grades. You may get good grades because you perceive that in the future you'll be getting a better job. Getting a better job will give you more money. More money will make you happier. There are also negative incentives. The reason why some people don't smoke is because they see these pictures of people's lungs, of those who have smoked and who've died of lung cancer. Those are negative incentives. But we make choices based upon those positive and negative incentives. We balance the costs and the benefits of those choices. And based upon those balances, we make a final decision. Positive incentives from growing up, often school children would get gold stars on their forehead. They don't do that as much as they did when I was a kid, but when I would come home, I would be plastered with gold stars on my forehead. My mom knew that I was doing a good job. If I came home without any stars, she was immediately on the phone calling my teachers to find out what kind of rotten child I'd been. Those are positive incentives. We respond to them a lot more than we think we do. Negative incentives like penalties, punishments. We file our taxes not because we love our government, not because we think we owe it, but because we think the long hand of the IRS will be coming down our throats, getting our money if we don't pay our taxes. There's a number of examples in the slides and in the text material on some of these incentives, and I encourage you to read it. But more than that, I encourage you to think about what things you do based upon the incentives that you receive. What decisions are you making here at school? What incentives are driving you to make those decisions? Aren't those all economic decisions? In addition to that, there's a number of other things that don't feel like economic incentives sometimes, but they are. For example, prestige. Things that we do to gain prestige. Sometimes we drive nice cars because of the prestige is important to us. Sometimes we do things for friendship because indeed friendship is important to us. Sometimes we do things for our husband or our wife or our girlfriend or our boyfriend or our siblings because we love them and because we want to be loved by them. These are all incentives. And they don't necessarily translate into dollars and cents all the time, but they're powerful and they influence us. Gifts are another incentive. However, gifts are tricky. Sometimes we give a gift because we see the inherent value in the thing that we're giving. Sometimes the people we're giving it to don't see the same value. Sometimes we give them a gift and we think they should really love us for this, so they'll put this gift up on their mantle. We go to their house and we find that's nowhere to be seen because they didn't perceive it the same way we do. So substituting gifts for incentives is often very difficult and very tricky. Because of that inability to understand how people will value things that we give them, an enormous economic change has taken place in the gift market. And now we give gift cards or gift certificates. When I ask my children what they want for Christmas, most of them say, I want money. Or I want a gift certificate to GameStop so I can go and get the game that I want. Why? Because they don't really trust that my knowledge of their incentives, of what gifts will incentivize them or will give them pleasure or value, are the same as their own. And so they want gift cards. They want the money. Okay, you doing good?
Mm-hmm. I just had to move it because you were moving. So
Am I starting to creep?
You were creeping a little bit, so I figured I'll just move the camera over a little bit.
Okay.
You're good now. I can move it back.
I don't know. If I do my best to stop moving, I'll be in good shape.
That's all right.
All right, is this making sense?
Yes, it does.
All right. Okay, so let's talk about economics as a science. And in this area, we're going to talk about models and theories. Models and theories are simplified representations of the real world. We use that as a basis for our predictions and our explanations. Think about this from the perspective of your parents. You're here at BYU Hawaii. Your parents are coming over to visit you for Christmas. And they're saying to you, how do we get to Laie? Well, what you could do is go onto Google Earth and type in Hawaii, and you'll get a big map of the islands of Hawaii. Type in Oahu, you get a picture of Oahu. And you can call them on the phone and say, now let me tell you, the airport is down in the southern part of this map. Laie is up on the north part of the map. So just drive from the south to the north and you'll get to Laie. And that's true. Not particularly helpful, but it is true. The map is a quintessential model, and all maps are based upon theories and assumptions. But if you really want to get your parents to Laie, you're going to have to give them some discrete directions. The problem is, we don't know all those details about people. So in economics, we tend to focus on the model side, the theory side, and we make broad assumptions. Now, in the process of going through this, you're going to find things that we talk about, and you're going to say, yeah, but that's not me. I don't behave that way. And it's very likely true. And that's okay, because the model and the theory isn't meant to describe everybody in precise precision. It's meant to be general, meant to be a big picture. Give us a general sense for how things move. And that's okay. But realize that all of these models are based upon a set of assumptions, circumstances in which the model is applicable. Every model or theory has to be based upon those assumptions. And you can question those assumptions, you can change the assumptions, we do that all the time. But it's important to understand how the model is designed, and the model is designed based upon those assumptions. A map simplifies a model of reality. The degree of simplification varies across maps. Some maps contain a lot more detail than other maps do, and some are general maps of the world. Economic models are the same. They tend to focus on what is relevant to the problem at hand, and we omit the things that aren't. Economic models are based upon this very important parable called the ceteris paribus assumption. It's the Latin and has a number of different meanings, but typically means other things are constant, other things are equal. It means nothing changes except for the factor or factors that we're studying. Let's give an example. Say you work at PCC, and you as a budding economist would like to study the impact of purchases at the Seasider Grill if you were to double your salary. So if we doubled your pay from $7.25 to $14.50 per hour, you want to study the impact of that doubling of pay on the number of sandwiches that are purchased from the Seasider. Sounds reasonable. The problem is, that's not the only purchasing decision you're going to be confronted with in your study. People get a doubling in their salary, they're probably going to go to town more often. They may buy more clothes. They may buy a car. They may do any number of other things. And that's going to skew your study. So you have to exercise this ceteris paribus assumption. And you have to assume that in this study, you're going to study the impact of an increase in salary or pay on the purchase of sandwiches at the Seasider, ceteris paribus, which means we're going to hold everything else constant. We're not going to let those other things move. We're going to assume that everybody still consumes the same amount of gasoline, goes to town the same number of times, has the same number of clothing, and we're just going to see how that impacts sandwiches in the seasider. It is unreasonable, it is unrational, but that we need to do in order to be able to make the study. So economics is an empirical science. We use real-world data. What empirical means is it's not just theoretical. Our theories are derived based upon what we see in the world. So real-world data is used to evaluate the usefulness of every model we have. Models are useful only if they can predict the economic phenomena that we're studying. Economic models predict how people react, not how they think. And that's the reason why we study what's called behavioral economics more and more. Behavioral economics is an approach to studying how people behave, consumer behavior, why we buy certain things, what decision-making process we go through in our brain to make those purchases. It emphasizes the psychological limitations and the complications which could interfere with our rational decision-making. It approaches this thing called bounded rationality. Now, we've talked about rationality and how unrational some things are with reference to chocolate purchases. Let's talk about bounded rationality. Bounded rationality has a hypothesis that people are nearly and not fully rational. They can't examine every choice available to them. They use sample rules of thumb or heuristics to sort alternatives. Let me give you an interesting example that some of you who are interested in sports may understand. If you think about sports figures, and specifically basketball figures, who would you consider to be one of the best, if not the best, basketball player of all time? If you did a list of 5, I'm sure Michael Jordan would come up on the list. And Michael Jordan, who is retired now, was a phenomenal basketball player. He moved around the court just in a liquid fashion and was able to make shots that nobody could think he could make. But he did some things that were pretty irrational. As a college student, he played for the North Carolina Tar Heels, and he was very good. When he went to the pros, he was a little bit self-conscious, and he was worried that the luck that he had as a college ball player wouldn't translate over to the NBA. So from the first game in the NBA, he did something very interesting. Now, this can possibly be explained by an interesting change in clothing design for basketball players. When I was younger, basketball shorts were short and were sort of tight. What Michael Jordan decided he had to do to be a good NBA player was wear his North Carolina Tar Heels basketball shorts under his NBA shorts. So for every game he played in the NBA, he wore his North Carolina Tar Heels shorts under his NBA shorts. Problem is, they weren't long enough. So you had to make them a little longer and a little baggier. Consequently, basketball shorts are now longer and baggier than they used to be to accommodate Michael Jordan's bounded rationality. Let's talk about positive and normative economics. In your study of economics, you're going to come across things that are both positive and normative. What positive economics means is that it's purely descriptive statements or predictions. If A happens, then B will result. That's a statement of what is. It's a positive economic statement. For example, if monetary supply increases, inflation will increase. That is a positive statement. It's a relationship that we know exists. Normative economics is different. It's an analysis that involves value judgments, relates to whether things should be done, whether they're good or bad, a statement of what ought to be. Our current unemployment rate is about 9.5%. We can make a normative economic statement and say, well, unemployment shouldn't be 9.5%. It maybe should be 6.5%. The fact that we use ought to be or should be is a normative or a value-laden judgment. Hence, consequently, that's considered normative economics.